All right. Doston, welcome back to Crypto Brain. Ladies and gentlemen, something extremely unusual appears to be developing around XRP right now, because across the crypto market, a fresh narrative involving the US Securities and Exchange Commission and XRP folders has started gaining serious momentum, and investors are now asking one major question: has the overall tone surrounding XRP quietly started to shift to risk the market once again, allowing emotion and speculation to run ahead of reality? Because if you truly understand the history between XRP and the Securities and Exchange Commission, then you already know this has never felt like a normal cryptocurrency story. This has always looked far bigger, a battle involving regulation, innovation, institutional finance, and the future direction of digital assets themselves. And perhaps that is exactly why every single time the SEC and XRP begin trending together, the entire crypto community immediately becomes emotionally activated. Because for many XRP holders, this is no longer simply about price action anymore, it's about validation, patience, and the belief that one day the market could completely reassess the role XRP may potentially play inside the future financial system. And ladies and gentlemen, the most dangerous force inside any financial market is not fee, but anticipation. Because the moment investors begin believing that a major shift could quietly be forming in the background, psychology starts moving long before the charts ever do. And right now, that appears to be exactly what is happening around XRP, because many investors believe that if the Securities and Exchange Commission eventually moves towards clearer digital asset frameworks and more transparent regulation, institutional confidence towards blockchain-based infrastructure could increase dramatically. And whenever institutional confidence begins centering a market, narratives can change extraordinarily quickly. And this is precisely why XRP once again finds itself back in the spotlight, because supporters continue arguing that fast settlement, low transaction costs, and cross-border liquidity solutions may become critically important within the next generation of global finance. And every single time conversations surrounding tokenization, instant settlement, or future banking systems begin strengthening, XRP somehow always manages to appear at the center of those discussions. However, this is where the situation becomes even more interesting, because crypto markets don't move purely on certainty, they move on possibility. And at this moment, possibility itself has become the fuel driving the entire XRP narrative forward. Because investors are no longer simply analyzing charts, they're attempting to imagine what the future financial world could potentially look like if blockchain infrastructure becomes deeply integrated into traditional finance. And naturally, if that transformation ever begins taking shape, markets will immediately search for assets positioned to benefit the most from that shift. And this is exactly why every discussion connected to the Securities and Exchange Commission now creates enormous curiosity within the XRP community, because holders are trying to determine whether regulators may eventually adopt a more innovation-friendly stance towards digital assets, or whether this is simply another temporary cycle driven by hype and speculation. However, history has repeatedly shown that the largest market movements often begin during periods when the majority of investors are still underestimating the narrative entirely, and perhaps that is why many experienced traders and institutional observers have quietly started monitoring XRP far more closely once again, because discussions involving tokenization, digital settlement infrastructure, blockchain liquidity systems, and instant global payments are no longer limited to crypto YouTube channels or online communities. These conversations are increasingly becoming visible across wider financial and institutional circles as well, and whenever trillion-dollar financial systems begin modernizing markets, naturally start paying attention to projects that could potentially fit into that future infrastructure. And this is precisely where excitement surrounding XRP continues growing stronger, because many holders believe that if the Securities and Exchange Commission eventually provides clear transparency and stronger regulatory direction, the impact may not remain limited to XRP alone, but could potentially become a major turning point for the entire digital asset industry. However, smart investors do not blindly follow excitement, they study the psychology developing behind the narrative itself, because genuine market movements almost always begin quietly in the background, long before the public fully recognizes what is happening. And that is why some investors now believe the current XRP discussion may not simply represent another social media-driven hype cycle, but perhaps an early signal of a much larger transformation gradually developing beneath the surface of the financial world itself. And ladies and gentlemen, here is another important reason why this discussion is spreading so aggressively across the crypto market, Because institutional finance appears to be moving closer and closer towards blockchain-based infrastructure every single year, and once major financial systems begin exploring faster settlement mechanisms, digital liquidity rails, and tokenized assets, investors naturally start searching for projects that may already be positioned ahead of the curve. And many XRP supporters believe this is exactly where XRP could potentially benefit, because whenever discussions involving cross-border settlement efficiency or banking modernization emerge, XRP consistently remains part of those conversations. An event Noon can guarantee how future regulation will ultimately develop. One thing is becoming increasingly clear: the relationship between traditional finance and digital assets is evolving far more rapidly than many people expected, and that evolutional one is enough to keep investors watch RP extremely closely, because financial markets always reward attention before they reward certainty, and at this moment attention surrounding XRP appears to be growing stronger once again. However, ladies and gentlemen, experienced traders understand something very important: markets can move aggressively in both directions, and emotion without discipline is one of the fastest ways investors lose money, which is why smart investors focus not only on opportunity but also on risk management, patience, and market structure, because while narratives create momentum, long-term survival inside crypto always depends on discipline and emotional control, especially during periods of extreme speculation and hype. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson investors should take from the current XRP discussion, because whether this narrative eventually becomes a genuine turning point or simply another temporary market cycle, one thing is undeniable: XRP has once again captured the attention of the wider crypto market, and now all eyes remain fixed on the Securities and Exchange Commission institutional adoption and the future direction of digital finance itself. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to hear your opinion. Do you believe XRP could eventually become a major part of the future financial infrastructure? Or do you think the market is once again allowing hype to move ahead of reality? Drop your thoughts down below, because this debate is only becoming bigger with every passing day. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you subscribe to Crypto Brain, turn on notifications, and join the community, because in this market the biggest opportunities often appear long before the majority finally recognize what is happening. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.